Section 1 of the Science History of the Universe, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. The Science History of the Universe, Volume 5, edited by Francis Rolt Wheeler. Biology, Chapter 1, The Science of Life. Life. That strange, mysterious, unknown something which flies through the viewless air, flashes through the ocean's depths, blushes in the petals of a rose, and manifests itself in 1,000 marvelous forms. Can science grasp, define, or explain it? Death, that wondrous change which, sooner or later, stills the activities of all forms of life and returns them to the realm of the lifeless. What is its nature? Why is it necessary? Can science understand or control it? These inquiries, and others like them, which have troubled the human mind in all ages, are the fundamental problems of the science of life. With the dawn of human consciousness, there must have come the realization that this is an earth with two worlds, the living and the lifeless. The progress of the ages has not lessened the contrast, and today men of science, recognizing the great chasm between life and death, between the living and the lifeless on the earth, are compelled to group the natural sciences into the biological sciences, dealing with living things or organisms, and the abiological sciences or physical sciences, dealing with lifeless matter. The biological sciences are known collectively as biology, which is therefore often defined as the science of life, of living things, or of living matter. But living matter, says Sedgwick and Wilson in their General Biology, is only ordinary matter which has entered into a peculiar state or condition, and hence biology is more precisely defined as the science which treats of matter in the living state. If the term biology be used in its widest sense of life lore, to include all the results of the scientific study of living creatures, it may be said to have had its foundations in antiquity. But if the term is restricted to the use as defined above, that is, to the study of the vital phenomena common to both plants and animals, it is quite modern. Biology is not a new name for the older science known as natural history, nor is it, as often thought, a combination of botany and zoology. It is rather a unified science of life. Taken in this sense, the science has been in existence but little more than 100 years. The history of its development is the history of the splitting up of the natural history of earlier times into the separate sciences known today: physics, chemistry, botany, zoology, etc. A recognition of the essential similarity of the vital functions of all living things, plants or animals, and the development of a separate science for the study of these phenomena. Huxley, in his essay on the study of biology, writes of its history in these words: At the revival of learning, knowledge was divided into two kinds, the knowledge of nature and the knowledge of man. For it was the current idea then, and a great deal of that ancient conception still remains, that there was a sort of essential antithesis, not to say antagonism, between nature and man, and that the two had not very much to do with one another, except that one was oftentimes exceedingly troublesome to the other. Though it is one of the salient merits of our great philosophers of the 17th century that they recognized but one scientific method, applicable alike to man and to nature, we find this notion of the existence of a broad distinction between nature and man in the writings both of Francis Bacon and of Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes says, "The register of knowledge of fact is called history, whereof there be two sorts, one called natural history, which is the history of such facts or effects of nature as have no dependence on man's will, such as are the histories of metals, plants, animals, regions, and the like. The other is civil history, which is the history of the voluntary actions of men in commonwealths. Thus all history of fact was divided into these two great groups of natural and of civil history. As time went on, and the various branches of human knowledge became more distinctly developed and separated from one another, it was found that some were much more susceptible of precise mathematical treatment than others. The publication of the Principia of Newton showed that precise mathematical methods were applicable to those branches of science such as astronomy and what is now called physics, which occupy a very large portion of the domain of what the old writers understood by natural history. Time went on, and yet other branches of science developed themselves. Chemistry took a definite shape, and since all these sciences, such as astronomy, natural philosophy, and chemistry, were susceptible either of mathematical treatment or of experimental treatment, or of both, a broad distinction was drawn between the experimental branches of what had previously been called natural history and the observational branches, those in which experiment was or seemed of doubtful use, and where at that time mathematical methods were inapplicable. Under these circumstances, the old name of natural history stuck by the residuum of these phenomena, which were not at the time susceptible of mathematical or experimental treatment. That is to say, those phenomena of nature which come now under the general heads of physical geography, geology, mineralogy, the history of plants, and the history of animals. It was in this sense that the term was understood by the great writers of the middle of the last century, Buffon and Linnaeus. By Buffon in his great work, Histoire naturelle generate, and by Linnaeus in his splendid achievement, the Systema Naturae. The subjects they deal with are spoken of as natural history, and they called themselves and were called naturalists. It is clear that such was not the original meaning of these terms, but that they had by this time acquired a signification widely different from that which they possessed primitively. Despite the marvelous progress made by science at the latter end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century, thinking men began to discern that under this title of natural history there were included very heterogeneous constituents. For example, it was not hard to see that geology and mineralogy were, in many respects, widely different from botany and zoology. That a man might obtain an extensive knowledge of the structure and functions of plants and animals without having need to enter upon the study of geology or mineralogy, and vice versa. And further, as knowledge advanced, it became clearer that there was a great analogy, a very close alliance between these two sciences of botany and zoology, which deal with living beings, while they are much more widely separated from all other studies. Therefore, is it not wonderful that at the beginning of the 19th century, in two different countries, and apparently without any intercommunication, two famous men clearly conceived the notion of uniting the sciences which deal with living matter into one whole, and of dealing with them as one discipline? In fact, there were three men to whom this idea occurred contemporaneously, although but two who carried it into effect, and only one who worked it out completely. These persons were the eminent physiologist Bichat, the great naturalist Lamarck in France, and a distinguished German Treviranus. Bichat assumed the existence of a special group of physiological sciences. Lamarck, in a work published in 1801, for the first time made use of the name biology, from the two Greek words which signify a discourse upon life and living things. About the same time, it occurred to Treviranus that all those sciences which deal with living matter were essentially and fundamentally one, and ought to be treated as a whole, and in the year 1802 he published the first volume of what he also called Biologic. Treviranus's great merit lies in this, that he carried out his idea and wrote the very remarkable work above mentioned. It consists of 6 volumes, and occupied its author for 20 years from 1802 to 1822. That is the origin of the term biology, which denotes the whole of the sciences which deal with living things, whether they be animals or whether they be plants. After discussing the origin of the science of biology, the next questions that naturally present themselves are with reference to the extent and nature of its scope. In its strict technical sense, biology denotes all the phenomena which are exhibited by living things, as distinguished from those which are not living. But while the secondary definition suffices in the domain of the lower animals and plants, it is found to involve considerable difficulties in an investigation of the higher forms of living things. For whatever views may be entertained about the nature of man, one thing is perfectly certain, that he is to be considered a living creature. Hence, a strict interpretation of such a definition must include man and all his ways and works under the head of biology, in which case psychology, politics, and political economy would be absorbed into the province of biology. It has been found convenient to set human psychology and sociology apart from biology. But the progress of these sciences in the past century has clearly shown that they are intrinsically inseparable from biology, or that they at least find many of their fundamental principles in the general science of life. Even without the psychological and sociological phases of human life, the field covered by biology, as thus understood, is so wide as to necessitate a subdivision of the subject into a number of branches, to which are usually assigned the rank of distinct sciences. As already pointed out, the usual division of biology into botany and zoology has the great advantage of practical convenience, since, as a matter of fact, most biologists devote their attention mainly either to plants alone or to animals alone. From a scientific point of view, however, a better subdivision is into morphology and physiology. The former is based upon the facts of form, structure, and arrangement, and is essentially statical. The latter upon those of action or function, and is essentially dynamical. But morphology and physiology are so intimately related that it is impossible to separate either subject absolutely from the other, for which reason authors speak of plant morphology and animal morphology, plant physiology and animal physiology. There are further subdivisions. Thus, on the plant or animal side of biology, there are the following subsciences. Anatomy, the science of structure, the term being usually applied to the coarser and more obvious composition of plants or animals. Histology, microscopical anatomy, the ultimate analysis of structure by the aid of the microscope, separated from anatomy only as a matter of convenience. Taxonomy, the classification of living things based chiefly on the phenomena of structure. Distribution, considering the position of living things in space and time, their distribution over the present face of the earth, and their distribution and succession at former periods, as displayed in fossil remains. Embryology, the science of development from the germ, including many problems pertaining both to morphology and physiology. And physiology, including pathology, the special science of the functions of the individual in health and in disease. The very highly specialized biological sciences, ornithology, birds, entomology, insects, herpetology, reptiles, conchology, shells, lichenology, lichens, bryology, mosses, mycology, fungi, etc., apply to the groups of animals and plants indicated by the names of these sciences. They are chiefly concerned with classification and hence deal largely with details of structure. While the scope of biology may be thus skeletonized, it must be pointed out with emphasis that the common conception of biology as simply a combination of botany and zoology is one which, though convenient and indeed necessary for practical purposes and for extended study and research, does not concern the present treatment. Dealing with organic structures and functions in connection with their causes, conditions, concomitants, and consequences, biology cannot divide itself into animal biology and vegetable biology, since the same fundamental classes of phenomena are common to both. It is with these general vital phenomena, common to both plants and animals, that this work is concerned. Hence, in considering the general problems of the science of biology, the familiar division into botany and zoology is recognized only occasionally as a matter of convenience. Undoubtedly, confusion will be avoided if it is kept in mind that general biology is the subject under view. This term does not designate a particular member of the group of biological sciences, but is only a convenient phrase which has recently come into use for the general introductory study of biology. It includes a description of the general properties of living matter, as revealed in the structures and actions of living things, and may serve as the basis for subsequent study of more special branches of the science. It deals with the broad characteristic phenomena and laws of life as they are illustrated by the thorough comparative study of a series of plants and animals taken as representative types. But inasmuch as all the varied phenomena which come under observation are in the last analysis due to the properties of matter in the living state, the biologist ever remembers that this matter and these properties are the goal of study. End of chapter 1. Section 2 of the Science History of the Universe, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. The Science History of the Universe, Volume 5, edited by Francis Rolt Wheeler. Biology, Chapter 2, The Nature of Life. More puzzling than the riddle propounded by the fabled Sphinx is the problem suggested by the title of this chapter. What is life? Is a question which has been asked by scholars of all ages, and man today is no nearer a final answer than were the philosophers in the earliest centuries of the historic era. Modern science has vastly extended knowledge of the phenomena which are called vital, but has failed to tell what life is. Thus, according to Herbert Spencer's so-called proximate definition, which of the many definitions of life has attracted most attention, life is the continuous adjustment of internal relations to external relations. This definition Spencer has explained as follows. All vital actions, considered not separately, but in their ensemble, have for their final purpose the balancing of certain outer processes by certain inner processes. These are unceasing external forces tending to bring the matter of which organic bodies consist into the state of stable equilibrium displayed by inorganic bodies. There are internal forces by which this tendency is constantly antagonized, and the perpetual changes which constitute life may be regarded as incidental to the maintenance of the antagonism. To preserve the erect posture, for instance, we see that certain weights have to be neutralized by certain strains. Each limb or other organ gravitating to the earth and pulling down the parts to which it is attached has to be preserved in position by the tension of sundry muscles, or in other words, the group of forces which would, if allowed, bring the body to the ground, has to be counterbalanced by another group of forces. Again, to keep up the temperature at a particular point, the external process of radiation and absorption of heat by the surrounding medium must be met by a corresponding internal process of chemical combination, whereby more heat may be evolved, to which add that if from the atmospheric changes the loss becomes greater or less, the production must become greater or less, and similarly throughout the organic actions in general. When we contemplate the lower kinds of life, we see that the correspondences thus maintained are direct and simple, as in a plant, the vitality of which mainly consists in osmotic and chemical actions responding to the coexistence of light, heat, water, and carbonic acid around it. But in animals, and especially in the higher orders of them, the correspondences become extremely complex, materials for growth and repair not being like those which plants require, everywhere present, but being widely dispersed and under special forms, have to be found, to be secured, and to be reduced to a fit state for assimilation. Hence the need for locomotion, hence the need for the senses, hence the need for prehensile and destructive appliances, hence the need for an elaborate digestive apparatus. Observe, however, that these successive complications are essentially nothing but aids to the maintenance of the organic balance in its integrity, in opposition to those physical, chemical, and other agencies which tend to overturn it. And observe, moreover, that while these successive complications subserve this fundamental adaptation of inner to outer actions, they are themselves nothing else but further adaptations of inner to outer actions. For what are these movements by which a predatory creature pursues its prey, or by which its prey seeks to escape, but certain changes in the organism fitted to meet certain changes in its environment? What is that compound operation which constitutes the perception of a piece of food, but a particular correlation of nervous modifications answering to a particular correlation of physical properties? What is that process by which food, when swallowed, is reduced to a fit form for assimilation, but a set of mechanical and chemical actions which distinguish the food? Whence it becomes manifest that while life in its simplest form is the correspondence of certain inner physico-chemical actions with certain outer physico-chemical actions, each advance to a higher form of life consists in a better preservation of this primary correspondence by the establishment of other correspondences. Divesting this conception of all superfluities and reducing it to its most abstract shape, we see that life is definable as the continuous adjustment of internal relations to external relations. It is clear that this definition in the last analysis is but a general statement of the fundamental vital relations existing between living matter and lifeless phenomena. It does not really define life. Other authors have done no better. In fact, their definitions have been less inclusive. But aside from attempts at forming abstract definitions of life, there are some significant considerations regarding living matter, which have been important in the development of knowledge of the differences between the living and the lifeless, and of the working of the mechanism of life. The living and the lifeless present a fundamental contrast. If the development of the conception of life be followed back, says Verworn, when mankind had no presentments of all the occupations that accompany a highly developed culture, when he was unacquainted with fire, when he did not know how to make even the most primitive tools, the conclusion is reached that the conception sprang from the combination of a number of simple phenomena, which early man discovered by self-observation, especially those phenomena that are associated with evident movements, such as locomotion, breathing, nutrition, the heartbeat, and others. In fact, it is not difficult to analyze into their primary constituents the complex occupations of our present life, and to recognize that its diversity is produced by various combinations of a few elementary phenomena, such as nutrition, respiration, growth, reproduction, movement, and the production of heat. It must be remembered, however, that such a conception of life is limited to the vital phenomena of human beings, while the field of life is far greater. Animals and plants likewise exhibit vital phenomena, and it may be asked whether these latter are the same as or different from the phenomena that prevail among men. It is evident that all living organisms must be included in the sphere of physiological investigation, the flower and the worm equally with man. Hence, the first duty of physiology is to mark out the field of the living, to determine what is living and what is not living, an undertaking that is more difficult than it appears. The conception of life has not always been the same. It has experienced fundamental changes in the course of the development of the human species. Formed first with respect to mankind, it was early extended to other objects. With primitive races, the conception was much wider than at present, and they termed living what is no longer regarded as such. With them, stars, fire, wind, and waves were being endowed with life and mind, and they were personified in the image of man. The remains of these ideas are still found in the mythology of the classic and modern races. In the course of time, the distinction between living and lifeless has been made constantly sharper, but even today, a child regards a steam engine as a living animal. The child is guided more or less consciously by the same criterion as the primitive races, who, from the fact of motion, considered as living the dancing flame of a fire or a moving wave. In fact, of all vital phenomena, motion is that which gives most strongly the impression of living. It may be said that only primitive races and children are misled by the criterion of motion, and that the civilized and adult man who is versed in a knowledge of life is capable of deciding easily in any given case between the living and the lifeless. But this is not always true. For example, are dried grains living or lifeless? Is a lentil that has lain unchanged in a chest for years living? Scientific men themselves are not agreed upon this point. The lentil, when dry, does not show phenomena of life, but if placed in moist earth, it can at any moment be induced to do so, and then sprouts and grows into a plant. The decision between the living and the lifeless becomes, however, much more difficult with objects that are not commonly seen in life, for example, certain microscopic things. Long observation and very detailed investigation are frequently required in order to determine whether certain bodies that are found in a liquid by microscopic examination are living or not. If a drop of the dregs be taken from a bottle of Weissbier and examined with a microscope, it will be found that the liquid contains innumerable small pale globules, often clinging together in groups of 2 or 3. Completely at rest so long as they are observed, and showing no trace of movement or other change. Very similar small globules may be observed with a microscope in a drop of milk. The two kinds of globules can be distinguished from one another by strong magnifying powers only. No trace of vital phenomena can be found in either by the most patient and continued microscopic examination. Yet, the two objects are as widely different as a living organism and a lifeless substance, for the globules from the beer are the so-called yeast cells, the active agent in the fermentation of the beer, and are fully developed unicellular living organisms, while the globules from the milk are lifeless droplets of fat, which by their abundant presence and the reflection of light from all sides give to the milk its white color. The manifestation of motion, which is often ascribed to an internal source because no external source is directly visible, thus frequently misleads to the assumption of life. Hence, under certain circumstances, it is not at all easy to distinguish the living from the lifeless, and it is accordingly clear that the first duty of physiology must be to inquire after the criteria of such a distinction, that is, mentally to circumscribe the subject matter, life, in relation to non-living nature. The distinction between living and lifeless matter is made still more complicated by the fact that the living substance of the human body, or of any animal or plant, is only the transformed lifeless matter of the food which has been taken into the body and has there assumed for a time the living state. Lifeless matter in the shape of food is continually streaming into all living things on the one hand, and passing out again as waste on the other. In its journey through the organism, some of this matter enters into the living state and lingers for a time as part of the bodily substance. But sooner or later it dies, and is then for the most part cast out of the body, though a part may be retained within it either as an accumulation of waste material or to serve some useful purpose. Matter may thus pass from the lifeless into the living state and back again to the lifeless, over and over in never-ending cycles. A living plant or animal is like a whirlpool into which and out of which matter is constantly streaming, while the whirlpool maintains its characteristic form and individuality. To put the matter in the most general shape, says Huxley, the body of the organism is a sort of focus to which certain material particles converge, in which they move for a time, and from which they are afterward expelled in new combinations. The parallel between a whirlpool in a stream and a living being, which has often been drawn, is just as it is striking. The whirlpool is permanent, but the particles of water which constitute it are incessantly changing. Those which enter it on the one side are whirled around and temporarily constitute a part of its individuality, and as they leave it on the other side, their places are made good by newcomers. Those who have seen the wonderful whirlpool 3 miles below the Falls of Niagara will not have forgotten the heaped-up wave which tumbles and tosses, a very embodiment of restless energy, where the swift stream hurrying from the falls is compelled to make a sudden turn toward Lake Ontario. However changeful in the contour of its crest, this wave has been visible, approximately in the same place and with the same general form for centuries past. Seen from a mile off, it would appear to be a stationary hillock of water. Viewed closely, it is a typical expression of the conflicting impulses generated by a swift rush of material particles. Now, with all our appliances, we cannot get within a good many miles, so to speak, of the living organism. If we could, we should see that it was nothing but the constant form of a similar turmoil of material molecules, which are constantly flowing into the organism on the one side and streaming out on the other. What are the distinctive properties of living matter as contrasted with lifeless matter? What are the elementary vital phenomena? The composition of living substance has long been supposed to hold the key to the mysteries of life manifestations. The ancients naively believed that they were able to explain the substance of living bodies by the intermixture of certain materials. Thus, Hippocrates believed that the normal human body consists of blood, phlegm, and bile, which are mixed together in certain proportions. In the Middle Ages, when people endeavored to solve the riddle of nature by the great power of alchemy, they thought that they were upon the track of the secret of living substance. How strong this delusion was is shown by the many attempts of the Middle Ages to produce living substance artificially. The ardent expectation with which the medieval alchemist in the somber dusk of his laboratory, surrounded by skilled workers and strange apparatus, hoped every moment to see the homonucleus arise complete from the retorts or crucibles is a very characteristic feature of the developmental stage of science during these centuries. But however proud moderns may be of the advancement of science, they have no right to look with scorn upon those attempts of the Middle Ages, when it is realized that from that time even to the most recent period, the attempts have been continued to produce not man himself, but the simplest forms of living substance. Yet all these attempts resemble the endeavor of a man to put together a complicated clockwork without knowing its essential parts. However simple the problem of the artificial production of living substance appeared to the Middle Ages, says Verworn, the progress of sober thought and critical investigation has shown constantly how far we are yet from a knowledge of the intimate composition of such substance. How is it possible to produce chemically a substance the chemical composition of which is not at all known? Modern research has been directed, therefore, more and more toward an examination of the composition of living substance. It has penetrated deeply and continues to penetrate into the morphological, physical, and chemical relations and the intimate structure of living matter. Although this accumulated knowledge concerning the composition of living matter does not distinguish between the living and the lifeless, it has given many interesting facts concerning the properties of living matter. In its physical properties, living matter in animal and plant tissues behaves like a liquid. The idea that vital phenomena can be associated with a solid substratum only is not only unjustified, but even untenable. Not only is it unsupported on any acceptable ground, but it even contradicts facts that may easily be observed. It is quite impossible to understand how protoplasm, in the more or less stiff condition of a framework or network, can be capable of streaming and flowing as can be observed so easily in certain plant cells and in amoeba. It is impossible for a solid network to flow in such a manner that the individual particles of its mass mix continually with one another, as may be seen so clearly in amoeba. If at first sight the theory of the solid consistency may not be incompatible with the behavior of cells that possess a constant form, it is absolutely so with the phenomena exhibited by naked protoplasmic masses. Hence, various investigators, especially Berthold and Bushley, have recently defended strongly the idea of the liquid nature of the cell contents, and no investigator who is familiar with the phenomena need hesitate to accept this view. Living matter has a greater density than water. That some animals and plants float is due to the accumulation in their tissues of certain lifeless matters such as fat and gases which diminish their specific gravity. In chemical structure, the differences between living and lifeless matter, although not distinctive, are of importance. Only 12 elements are found constantly in living matter: carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, hydrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, chlorine, potassium, sodium, magnesium, calcium, and iron. A few others, silicon, fluorine, bromine, iodine, aluminum, and manganese, are found occasionally. But all these elements are also found in the lifeless matter composing the air, water, and the surface of the earth. Since the chemical analysis of living substance has shown that no constituents but these organic elements are to be found in the organism, the important fact follows that an elementary vital substance exists no more than a specific vital force. The conception of a vital ether, a spiritus animalis, a vital matter, etc., with which the earlier physiology so freely dealt, have therefore, in harmony with the advanced development which analytical chemistry has undergone at the present time, completely disappeared from the present theory of life. Living substance is composed of no different chemical materials from those occurring within lifeless bodies. Nevertheless, one fact deserves mention, namely that the few general organic elements are not scattered irregularly here and there through the natural system of elements, but they occupy a definite position, being remarkable as elements having very low atomic weights. Hence, writes Verworn, the conclusion may, with great probability, be drawn that in the evolution of the elements, the organic elements arose by condensation very early, and therefore existed in the very early stages of the development of our planetary system, at a time when other elements, such as the heavy metals, had not yet been formed. Following the discovery that living matter contains no distinctive chemical elements, physiological chemists turned their attention to the search for specific chemical compounds. Here the investigation is most difficult. It is not possible to apply the methods of chemistry to living substance without killing it. Every chemical reagent that comes in contact with it disturbs it and changes it, and what is left for investigation is no longer a living substance, but a corpse, a substance that has wholly different properties. Hence, ideas upon the chemistry of the living object can be obtained only by deductions from chemical discoveries in the dead object. Deductions, the corrections of which can be proved experimentally in the living object only in rare cases. This alone is responsible for the excessively slow advance of the knowledge of the chemistry of the vital process. It is evident that the greatest foresight is necessary in applying results obtained upon the dead object to conditions in the living, and it must be constantly borne in mind that the chemical relations of the latter are to be distinguished sharply from those of the former. Although there is no fundamental difference between the elements composing living and those composing lifeless substance. In other words, although no special vital element exists in the organic world, some of the elements in living substance form unique compounds which characterize it only and are never found in lifeless substances. Thus, there exist in the former, besides chemical compounds that occur also in the latter, specific organic complexes of atoms. Many of these organic compounds, especially those that are of special importance to living substance, possess so complicated a constitution that thus far chemistry has not succeeded in obtaining an insight into the spatial relations of the atoms in their molecules, although the percentage composition of the molecules is known to a greater extent. There are especially three chief groups of chemical bodies and their transformation products, by the presence of which living substance is distinguished from lifeless substance. These are proteids, fats, and carbohydrates. Of these, only the proteids and their derivatives have been demonstrated with certainty as common to all cells. Hence they must be set apart among the organic constituents of living matter as the essential or general substances in contrast to all special substances. It is not, however, the mere presence of proteids which is characteristic of living matter. White of egg, albumin, contains an abundance of a typical proteid, and yet it is absolutely lifeless. Living matter does not simply contain proteids, but has the power to manufacture them out of other substances. And this is the property of living matter exclusively. While the other organic compounds, carbohydrates and fats, and some simpler substances, have not been found in all living matter, it is a significant fact that they are derived from proteids and are necessary to the construction of proteids. But even the presence of the so-called organic compounds, proteids, carbohydrates, and fats, is an uncertain distinction between the living and the lifeless, for chemistry is rapidly breaking down the supposed barrier between the organic and the inorganic. Each year records new synthetic combinations of compounds supposed to be produced by living matter. Who knows when even the proteid molecule may yield its secret to some synthetic chemist? Thus the conclusion is reached, strange at first sight, that the matter constituting the living world is identical with that which forms the inorganic world. And not less true, says Huxley, is it that remarkable as are the powers, or in other words, as are the forces which are exerted by living beings, yet all these forces are either identical with those which exist in the inorganic world, or they are convertible into them. I mean in just the same sense as the researchers of physical philosophers have shown that heat is convertible into electricity, that electricity is convertible into magnetism, magnetism into mechanical force or chemical force, and any one of them into the other, each being measurable in terms of the other. Even so, I say that great law is applicable to the living world. The composition of living matter, as known in modern chemistry, then does not satisfactorily distinguish between living and lifeless matter, and the question, what is the characteristic difference, again forces itself to the center of attention. The generally accepted answer is that this difference is to be found in certain powers of properties of living matter. These are the power of waste, repair, growth, and the power of reproduction. Living matter, to quote from Sedgwick and Wilson, is continually wasting away by a kind of internal combustion, but continually repairs the waste by the process of growth. Moreover, this growth is of a characteristic kind, differing absolutely from the so-called growth of lifeless things. Crystals and other lifeless bodies grow, if at all by accretion or the addition of new particles to the outside. Living matter grows from within by intussusception, or taking in new particles and fitting them into the interstice between those already present, throughout the whole mass. And lastly, living matter not only thus repairs its own waste, but also gives rise by reproduction to new masses of living matter which become detached from the parent mass and enter forthwith upon an independent existence. We may perceive how extraordinary these properties are by supposing a locomotive engine to possess like powers, to carry on a process of self-repair in order to compensate for wear, to grow and increase in size, detaching from itself at interval pieces of brass or iron endowed with the power of growing up step by step into other locomotives capable of running themselves and of reproducing new locomotives in their turn. Precisely these things are done by every living thing, and nothing in any degree comparable with them takes place in the lifeless world. In connection with the foregoing, it should be noted that some modern authors, notably Verworn, hold that even metabolism, the power of waste, repair, and growth, does not constitute a fundamental contrast between living organisms and inorganic bodies. For example, there are rare cases known to chemists in which simple chemical compounds, under certain conditions, undergo a regular succession of destructions and constructions, always with the gain or loss of substances, which correspond in principle to the continued streaming of matter through the constructive and destructive changes in the metabolism of living substances. Metabolism, then, cannot be said to be absolutely distinctive as a general principle of living matter, but practically the metabolism of proteid, which is found in nature only in organic bodies, is sufficiently distinctive of living matter. The discovery of apparently analogous processes in inorganic substances simply suggests that the chemical changes concerned in the powers or activities of living matter are subject to the same fundamental laws as govern change in lifeless matter. Certain critical physiologists have pointed out that reproduction is not absolutely distinctive. It is true that in higher organisms in which reproduction involves development of eggs, seeds, or germs, reproduction is absolutely incomparable with any process in lifeless matter. But many microscopic organisms reproduce by simple division without development, and such simple reproduction is not far removed from similar changes which may occur in lifeless matter. But here again, these are really only suggestions of similarity between living and lifeless processes. To most present-day biologists, the known facts of reproduction, like those of metabolism, are not in any scientific sense paralleled by processes occurring in inorganic matter. Finally, even the method of growth by intussusception of particles has been said to offer no criterion of distinction for liquids, and living matter is liquid, grow by intussusception. However, this strikes many biologists as a mere quibble with words, for growth by intussusception in organisms involves other changes. For example, foods, not proteids, may be the material for growth of plant proteid, and plant proteid may in turn serve as food for growth and give rise to animal proteid. Such critical comparisons, suggesting that metabolism, growth, and reproduction are not entirely absent from lifeless matter, are interesting. But in the present state of scientific knowledge, the process involved in waste repair, growth, and reproduction are to be considered strikingly characteristic of living matter. These are probably complications of simple chemico-physical processes, some of which suggest similarity between living and lifeless matter, but the very complexity of the metabolic and reproductive processes in living forms is distinctive. A parallel case is that of proteid, of which has been stated the most distinctive feature is the complexity of its molecule. End of chapter 2.
Section 3 of the Science, History of the Universe, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Science, History of the Universe, Volume 5, edited by Francis Rolt Wheeler. Biology, Chapter 3, The Physiological Idea of Life, Part 1. Accepting the complicated processes of metabolism and reproduction as distinguishing characteristics of life, the force back of these distinctive powers or properties of living matter becomes a fruitful topic for investigation. Thompson in the Science of Life discusses this question. Over and over again in the history of biology, the doctrine of a special vital force has arisen, held sway for a time, and then disappeared. It arises as a reaction from the false simplicity of premature solutions, or as a despairing retreat in the face of baffling problems, or as the result of misunderstanding the real aim of science. The doctrine is an old one, for even if we ignore the speculations of the ancients, it must date at least from Paracelsus and Van Helmont. As it has naturally taken very different forms in different generations, the word vitalism, so often used, has little definite meaning. There is a sense in which no modern physiologist is a vitalist, since none rejects physico-chemical interpretations, as the early French vitalists did. There is a sense in which all modern physiologists are vitalists, since none pretends to know the secret of that particular synthesis, which even the simplest of organisms illustrates. The phrase vital force may be used as a general expression for the energies resident in living matter and may serve to suggest that we do not at present understand them or how they are related in the unity of the organism. But the phrase was originally used to denote a hypermechanical force, a mystical power, resident in living creatures, and quite different from thermic, electric, and other forms of energy. This was the meaning attached to the phrase by the disciples of Haller by Louis Dumas, 1765 to 1813, by Real, 1759 to 1813, and the other early vitalists. It can only be said that an appeal to such a force violates the scientific method and abandons the scientific problem. Again and again, in regard to particular points, subsequent progress has shown that the loss in faith in science was premature. According to the hypothesis of vitalism, the phenomena of life are inexplicable apart from a special vital force exclusively resident in organisms and different from the chemico-physical energies of the inanimate world. Thus the great pathologist and anatomist Henel, died 1885, believed in a non-material agent associated with the organism, presiding over the metabolism of the body, capable of reproducing the typical form and of endless partition without diminution of intensity. It is altogether an error to suppose that a refusal to believe in such a special, vital force implies materialism. The questions are quite separate. The former has to do with scientific method, the latter is a philosophical theory. Thus Huxley was certainly no believer in a vital force, yet he was clearly an idealist, and the same might be said of many. Every physiologist will, I believe, admit that he cannot at present give a physico-chemical interpretation of contractility or of irritability, of digestion or of absorption, of respiration or of circulation. What he can give is a partial analysis of these functions in simpler terms. This must remain the case until we discover the secret of synthesis, which the simplest unicellular organism expresses. The neo-vitalists, such as Bunge and Rindfleisch, emphasize the fact that there is no present possibility of giving a complete chemico-physical restatement of any observed function. There are always residual phenomena, and that the known physico-chemical causes do not seem adequate to the result. In other words, the categories of mechanism, of chemistry and physics cannot be forced upon vitality without doing violence to the very idea of the organism, a complex adaptive synthesis of matter and energy whose secret remains unread. When the neo-vitalists go forth and insist on an idealistic as opposed to a materialistic conception, they may be quite correct, but they are raising another question, which is philosophical rather than biological. Huxley, in his famous address, On the Physical Basis of Life, has well stated the case against the existence of a vital force. What justification is there then, he says, for the assumption of the existence in living matter of something which has no representative or correlative in the not living matter which gave rise to it? What better philosophical status has vitality than aquosity? And why should vitality hope for a better fate than the other ities, which have disappeared since Martinus Scriblerus accounted for the operation of the meat jack by its inherent meat-roasting quality, and scorned the materialism of those who explain the turning of the spit by a certain mechanism worked by the draft of the chimney? If scientific language is to possess a definite and constant signification whenever it is employed, it seems to me that we are logically bound to apply to the protoplasm or physical basis of life the same conceptions as those which are held to be legitimate elsewhere. If the phenomena exhibited by water are its properties, so are those presented by protoplasm, living or dead, its properties. If the properties of water may be properly said to result from the nature and disposition of its component molecules, I can find no intelligible ground for refusing to say that the properties of protoplasm result from the nature and disposition of its molecules. This idea of the physical basis of life, so clearly stated by Huxley, has been further developed by Dr. Michael Foster, whose line of thought is as follows. The more the molecular problems of physiology are studied, the stronger becomes the conviction that the consideration of what we call structure and composition must, in harmony with the modern teachings of physics, be approached under the dominant conception of modes of motion. The physicists have been led to consider the qualities of things as expressions of internal movements. Even more imperative does it seem to us that the biologist should regard the qualities of living matter, including structure and composition, as in like manner the expressions of internal movements. He may speak of living matter as a complex substance, but he must strive to realize that what he means by that is a complex whirl, an intricate dance, of which what he calls chemical composition, histological structure, and gross configuration are, so to speak, the figures. To him the renewal of protoplasm is but the continuance of the dance, its functions and actions, the transferences of the figures. It seems to us necessary, for a satisfactory study of the problems, to keep clearly before the mind the conception that the phenomena in question are the result, not the properties of kinds of matter, but of kinds of motion. Before passing from the consideration of vital force and the physical basis of life, it will be of interest to compare the views of the biologists Huxley and Foster with that expressed in a lecture by the great physicist Tyndall. The origin, growth, and energies of living things, he reminded his hearers, are subjects which have always engaged the attention of thinking men. To account for them, it was usual to assume a special agent, free to a great extent from the limitations observed among the powers of inorganic nature. This agent was called vital force, and under its influence, plants and animals were supposed to collect their materials and to assume determinate forms. Within the last few years, however, our ideas of vital processes have undergone profound modifications, and the interest and even disquietude which the change has excited are ample evidence by the discussions and protests which are now common regarding the phenomena of vitality. In tracing these phenomena through all their modifications, the most advanced philosophers of the present day declare that they ultimately arrive at a single source of power, from which all vital energy is derived, and the disquieting circumstance is that this source is not the direct fiat of a supernatural agent, but a reservoir of what, if we do not accept the creed of Zoroaster, must be regarded as inorganic force. In short, it is considered as proved that all the energy which we derive from plants and animals is drawn from the sun. A few years ago, when the sun was affirmed to be the source of life, 9 out of 10 of those who are alarmed by the form which this assertion has latterly assumed would have assented in a general way to its correctness. Their assent, however, was more poetic than scientific, and they were by no means prepared to see a rigid mechanical signification attached to their words. This, however, is the peculiarity of modern conclusions, that there is no creative energy whatever in the vegetable or animal organism, but that all the power which we obtain from the muscles of man and animals, as much as that which we develop by the combustion of wood or coal, has been produced at the sun's expense. To most minds, however, the energy of light and heat presents itself as a thing totally distinct from ordinary mechanical energy. Either of them can nevertheless be derived from the other. Wood can be raised by friction to the temperature of ignition, while by properly striking a piece of iron, a skillful blacksmith can cause it to glow. Thus, by the rude agency of his hammer, he generates light and heat. This action, if carried far enough, would produce the light and heat of the sun. In fact, the sun's light and heat have actually been referred to the fall of meteoric matter upon his surface, and whether the sun is thus supported or not, it is perfectly certain that he might be thus supported. If then solar light and heat can be produced by the impact of dead matter, and if from the light and heat thus produced we can derive the energies which we have been accustomed to call vital, it indubitably follows that vital energy may have approximately mechanical origin. In what sense, then, is the sun to be regarded as the origin of the energy derivable from plants and animals? Let us try and give an intelligible answer to this question. Water may be raised from the sea level to a high elevation and then permitted to descend. In descending, it may be made to assume various forms, to fall in cascades, to spurt in fountains, to boil in eddies, or to flow tranquilly along a uniform bed. It may, moreover, be caused to set complex machinery in motion, to turn millstones, throw shuttles, work saws and hammers, and drive piles. But every form of power here indicated would be derived from the original power expended in raising the water to the height from which it fell. There is no energy generated by the machinery. The work performed by the water in descending is merely the parceling out and distribution of the work expended in raising it. In precisely this sense is all the energy of plants and animals, the parceling out and distribution of a power originally exerted by the sun. In the case of the water, the source of the power consists in the forcible separation of a quantity of the liquid from a low level of the earth's surface and its elevation to a higher position, the power thus expended being returned by the water in its descent. In the case of vital phenomena, the source of power consists in the forcible separation of the atoms of compound substances by the sun. We name the force which draws the water earthward gravity, that which draws atoms together chemical affinity. But these different names must not mislead us regarding the qualitative identity of the two forces. They are both attractions, and to the intellect, the falling of carbon atoms against oxygen atoms is not more difficult of conception than the falling of water to the earth. The building up of the vegetable, then, is effected by the sun through the reduction of chemical compounds. The phenomena of animal life are more or less complicated reversals of these processes of reduction. We eat the vegetable and we breathe the oxygen of the air, and in our bodies the oxygen, which had been lifted from the carbon and hydrogen by the action of the sun, again falls toward them, producing animal heat and developing animal forms. Through the most complicated phenomena of vitality, this law runs. The vegetable is produced while a weight rises. The animal is produced while a weight falls. But the question is not exhausted here. The water employed in our first illustration generates all the motion displayed in its descent, but the form of the motion depends on the character of the machinery imposed in the path of the water. In a similar way, the primary action of the sun's rays is qualified by the atoms and molecules among which their energy is distributed. Molecular forces determine the form which the solar energy will assume. In the separation of the carbon and oxygen, this energy may be conditioned as to result in one case in the formation of a cabbage, and in another case in the formation of an oak. So also, as regards the reunion of the carbon and the oxygen, the molecular machinery through which the combining energy acts may, in one case, weave the texture of a frog, while in another it may weave the texture of a man. The matter of the animal body is that of inorganic nature. There is no substance in the animal tissues which is not primarily derived from the rocks, the water, and the air. Are the forces of organic matter, then, different in kind from those of inorganic matter? The philosophy of the present day negatives the question. It is the compounding, in the organic world, of forces belonging equally to the inorganic that constitutes the mystery and the miracle of vitality. Every portion of every animal body may be reduced to purely inorganic matter. A perfect reversal of this process of reduction would carry us from the inorganic to the organic, and such a reversal is at least conceivable. The tendency, indeed, of modern science is to break down the wall of partition between organic and inorganic, and to reduce both to the operation of forces which are the same in kind, but which are differently compounded. Consider the question of personal identity in relation to that of molecular form. 34 years ago, Mayer of Heilbronn, with that power of genius which breathes large meanings into scanty facts, pointed out that the blood was the oil of the lamp of life, the combustion of which sustains muscular action. The muscles are the machinery by which the dynamic power of the blood is brought into play. Thus the blood is consumed. But the whole body, though more slowly than the blood, wastes also, so that after a certain number of years it is entirely renewed. How is the sense of personal identity maintained across this flight of molecules? To man, as we know him, matter is necessary to consciousness, but the matter of any period may be all changed, while consciousness exhibits no solution of continuity. Like changing sentinels, the oxygen, hydrogen, and carbon that depart seem to whisper their secret to their comrades that arrive, and thus, while the non-ego shifts, the ego remains the same. Constancy of form in the grouping of the molecules, and not constancy of the molecules themselves, is the correlative of this constancy of perception. Life is a wave which in no two consecutive moments of its existence is composed of the same particles. Supposing then the molecules of the human body, instead of replacing others, and thus renewing a pre-existing form, to be gathered first-hand from nature and put together in the same relative positions as those which they occupy in the body. Supposing them to have the selfsame forces and distribution of forces, the selfsame motions and distribution of motions, would this organized concourse of molecules stand before us as a sentient thinking being? There seems no valid reason to believe that it would not. Or, supposing a planet carved from the sun, set spinning round an axis, and revolving round the sun at a distance from him equal to that of our earth, would one of the consequences of its refrigeration be the development of organic forms? I lean to the affirmative. Structural forces are certainly in the mass, whether or not those forces reach to the extent of forming a plant or an animal. In an amorphous drop of water lie latent all the marvels of crystalline force, and who will set limits to the possible play of molecules in a cooling planet? If these statements startle, it is because matter has been defined and maligned by philosophers and theologians who were equally unaware that it is at bottom essentially mystical and transcendental. End of section 3. Section 4 of the Science, History of the Universe, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Science, History of the Universe, Volume 5, edited by Francis Rolt Wheeler. Biology, Chapter 3. The Physiological Idea of Life, Part 2. Summarizing the foregoing discussion concerning the nature and general conditions of life and living matter, the fact stands out clearly and distinctly that life from its beginning has been dependent upon the external conditions of the Earth's surface. In a mathematical sense, life is a function of the Earth's development. Living substance could not exist while the Earth was a molten sphere without a solid, cool crust. It was obliged to appear with the same inevitable necessity as a chemical combination when the necessary conditions were given, and it was obliged to change its form and composition in the same measure as the external conditions of life changed in the course of the Earth's development. It is only a portion of the Earth's matter. The combination of this matter into living substance was as much the necessary product of the Earth's development as was the origin of water. It was an inevitable result of the progressive cooling of the masses that form the Earth's crust. Likewise, the chemical, physical, and morphological characteristics of existing living substance are the necessary result of the influence of the external conditions of life upon the internal relations of past living substance. Internal and external vital conditions are inseparably correlated, and the expression of this correlation is life. The artificial production of life would thus seem a theological possibility. It has been several times suggested in the discussion of the chemical aspects of life that living matter may sooner or later be produced in the chemist's laboratories. However improbable this suggestion may seem, there are many facts which point to its possibility. Heraclitus compared life with fire. Such a comparison is a pertinent one. Consideration of vital conditions makes this more evident. It has been shown that life, to quote Verworm, like fire, is a phenomena of nature, which appears as soon as the complex of its conditions is fulfilled. If these conditions are all realized, life must appear with the same necessity as fire appears when its conditions are realized. Likewise, life must cease as soon as the complex of its conditions has undergone disturbance, and with the same necessity with which fire is extinguished when the conditions for its maintenance cease. If, therefore, all vital conditions had been investigated in their minutest details, and it were possible artificially to establish them exactly, life would be produced synthetically, just as fire is produced, and the idea that existed in the imagination of the medieval alchemists in their attempted production of a homunculus would be achieved. But, notwithstanding the fact that this theoretical possibility cannot be denied, every attempt at the present time to produce life artificially and to imitate in the laboratory the obscure act of spontaneous generation must appear preposterous. So long as knowledge of the composition of living substance is so imperfect as it is now, the attempt artificially to compound living substance will be like the undertaking of an engineer to put together a machine, the most important parts of which are wanting. For the present, the task of physiology can consist only in the investigation of life. When physiology shall actually have accomplished this, it may think of testing the completeness and correctness of its achievement by the artificial creation of life. The nature of life has become better understood by the study of death, which to the biologist is simply the cessation of the activities of life. In the first place, it is sometimes extremely difficult to distinguish between life and apparent death. Several illustrations will make this clear. In India, where mystery and magic have always prevailed, the belief seems to have existed for a long time that many men, especially the so-called fakirs, whose existences are full of privation and self-inflicted torture, and who are supposed to possess special holiness, have the remarkable power of voluntarily putting a complete stop to their lives for a time, and later resuming them undisturbed and unchanged. A great number of such cases in which the fakirs have been buried in this condition of suspended animation, and after some time have been taken from their graves, have been reported by travelers from India. It is not to be denied that these tales, especially those of the Indian fakirs, are calculated to awaken distrust, and a sound skepticism is the basis of all good criticism. If, however, from all the known stories, their more or less sensational accompaniments be removed, the simple statement remains that certain men can voluntarily put themselves into a state in which no vital phenomena are demonstrable by a more or less superficial examination and can awaken later to normal life. Now, sufficient cases are known where physicians, by the usual methods of their practice, are able to discover absolutely no traces of vital phenomena, where pulse, respiration, movement, and irritability are not to be observed, and yet where the person, supposedly dead, has after a time returned to life. These phenomena are usually termed apparent death, and are connected with those of normal sleep by a series of transition phenomena. Such transition phenomena are the continual sleep in which persons, such as the sleeping soldier and the sleeping miner, authenticated medical cases, continue in a state of depressed vital activity and are absolutely incapable of being wakened, and especially the phenomena of the winter sleep of warm-blooded animals. However doubtful may be the reported powers of the representatives of the vertebrate or backboned animals to suspend for a time all vital phenomena, there is no longer any question that many of the lower animals have this power highly developed. As long ago as 1719, Leeuwenhoek, the famous improver of the microscope, discovered that small animals, known as rotifers, may be dried completely to dust and again restored to active life by being placed in water. One of the most remarkable cases of this kind, described by Verworn, is that of the tardigrade, or bear animalcule, which, so long as it is in water, performs all its vital phenomena like other animals. But if it be isolated and allowed to dry slowly upon a slide, it is seen that the more the water evaporates, the slower become its movements, until finally they cease entirely when the drop is dried up. Then the body gradually shrinks, the skin becomes wrinkled and folded, the form becomes gradually indistinguishable, and sometime after the animal has become dried, it can scarcely be distinguished from a grain of sand. In this dried condition, it can remain for many years without undergoing the slightest change. If it be moistened again with water, the return of life to the desiccated body after its sleep can be followed with the microscope. The awakening of the tardigrade, or the anabiosis, as Pryor has termed the process, takes place somewhat as follows. The body swells up and becomes extended, the folds and wrinkles slowly disappear, the extremities project, the animal soon assumes its normal shape. At first it remains quiet, then after a time varying, according to the duration of the drying, from a quarter of an hour to several hours, movements, at first slow and feeble, begin and gradually become stronger and more frequent, until after some time the animal, unaided, creeps away to resume life at the point where it was interrupted. Likewise, the seeds of many plants retain their power of germination for long periods of time. Here it might be well to add that the well-known story that wheat seeds taken from the graves of the Egyptian mummies will germinate, though thousands of years old, has been disproved by Mariette, the famous Egyptologist. However, from many observations it seems certain that many plant seeds, when completely dried, can retain their power to germinate for more than 100 or perhaps 200 years. These rare facts are of great importance in forming a conception of life and demand exhaustive investigation. The question to be considered is whether it is allowable to regard organisms in this peculiar condition as really lifeless. It has been pointed out in the earlier part of this chapter that it is metabolism in which the living organism differs from lifeless matter. But this is difficult to settle in some of the concrete cases mentioned above. Do dust-dry animals and seed possess no metabolism, or is this metabolism so depressed or so slight that investigation cannot determine whether the life process is at a standstill or whether a vita minima exists? Delicate experiments within the last 20 years show no evidence of the use of oxygen or the production of carbonic acid or other products of metabolism in dried organisms sealed for months in airtight tubes. From the results of these experiments, it can no longer be doubted that in desiccated organisms there is a complete standstill of life. Can organisms in this peculiar condition be termed dead? In reality, they are lifeless, but not dead, for anabiosis is possible after the application of water, while nothing can bring dead organisms back to life. The distinction between the dried and the dead organism lies in the fact that in the former, all the internal vital conditions are still fulfilled, and only the external conditions, in part, have appeared, while in the latter the internal vital conditions have experienced irreparable disturbances, although the external conditions can still be fulfilled. Pryor illustrates this distinction very happily. He compared the dried organism to a clock that has been wound but has stopped, so that it needs only a push to set it going, and the dead organism to a clock that is broken and cannot be made to go by a push. Hence a sharp distinction must be made between dried and dead organisms. But dried organisms cannot be called living, for they exhibit no vital phenomena, and as has been seen, vital phenomena are the criterion of life. It is best, therefore, to apply to them the expression apparently dead. Still more difficult than cases of apparent death is the determination of an exact limit between life and active death. In daily life, it is easy to distinguish the dead organism from the living, for from the human body and from the higher animals, a general conception of death has been formed, and it is usual to consider it as occurring at the moment when the heart, hitherto never quiet, stands still, and the individual ceases to breathe. But this is merely following the superficial habits of daily life and taking into consideration only the gross differences that make their appearance at that time, without noticing the continuance of certain phenomena after this all-important moment. The criterion of life is formed only by the vital phenomena, for example, by the various phases in which the vital process or the metabolism becomes evident to the senses. But if this criterion be applied to the human being at the moment usually termed the moment of death, it is found that in reality he is not dead. It is true that the spontaneous gross muscular movements cease, the man becomes relaxed and quiet, but the muscles frequently remain for several hours sensitive to external influences, responding to the latter with twitchings and movements of the limbs, in other words, showing vital phenomena. A moment even comes when the muscles gradually contract once more spontaneously. This is the death stiffening, rigor mortis. Not until this has passed is the life of the muscles extinguished. Nevertheless, even then the body is not entirely dead. Certain parts only, certain organs or cell complexes, such as the cells of the nervous system and of the muscles, no longer show vital phenomena, but other cells and cell complexes continue to live unchanged long after rigor mortis has passed. What moment then shall be designated as the moment of death? If the existence of vital phenomena be employed as the criterion, then the moment when spontaneous muscular movement, especially the activity of the heart, ceases, cannot consistently be regarded as the moment of death, for other cell complexes continue to live for a long time thereafter. It is evident, therefore, that there is no definite point of time at which life ceases and death begins, but there is a gradual passage from normal life to complete death, which frequently begins to be noticeable during the course of a disease. Death is developed out of life. It is true that the above example is that of a highly complicated organism, but even in the lowest and simplest microscopic organisms, death comes on gradually and, as in the higher animals, is the end result of a long series of processes which begin with an irreparable injury to the normal body and lead step by step to complete cessation of life activities. To this series of stages in the development of death, Schultz and Virchow, 1870, famous in pathology, have given the term necrobiosis, the gradual transition between life and death. It is seen, therefore, that it is impossible to draw a sharp line between life and death, that life and death are only the two end results of a long series of changes which run their course successively in the organism. But if, after having established this fact, says Verworn, the transition stages be left out of consideration for the moment, and only the two end results be considered, on the one side, the uninjured living organism, and on the other, the same organism, killed and preserved in alcohol by the modern technical methods, a sharp distinction between these two can be recognized in the fact that in the former, the life process goes on undisturbed, as is evident from the appearance of all vital phenomena, while in the latter, it is forever at a complete standstill, as is shown by the absence of even the slightest phenomena of life. End of section 4.
Section 5 of the Science History of the Universe, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Thomas Bosk. The Science History of the Universe, Volume 5, edited by Francis Rolt Wheeler. Biology, Chapter 4, The Origin of Life, Part 1. The discussion of the origin of life is introduced by J. Arthur Thomson of Aberdeen University in The Science of Life, with the following words. If it were the object of this book to give a statement of the established facts of biology, our discussion of the origin of life might be condensed into a single sentence. We do not know anything in regard to the origin of life. The only certainty is a negative one. There is no established case in which living organisms have arisen apart from parent organisms of the same kind. There are two distinct questions connected with the origin of life. First, how did it first originate in the early eras of the world's history? And second, does life today originate spontaneously in inorganic matter? It seems best to consider these separately. Professor Max Wervern of the University of Jena gives a good summary of the various theories concerning the origin of life, and it is from his General Physiology that some of the following illustrations have been taken. The origin of life upon the earth is a first and leading problem. The idea that the earth was once in a highly heated condition is accepted in modern science. And this fact, that it once was in a condition in which the temperature was enormously high and not a drop of water existed upon it, in short, a condition in which the vital conditions that are now regarded as indispensable to the existence of organisms were wanting, will always be an important factor with which all speculations upon the origin of life upon the earth must deal. Obviously, in that highly heated condition, life in its present form, at least, could not have existed. Then one of two things must have happened after the earth cooled down. Either inorganic matter must have become living matter, or living matter must have come from other planets than this. But if life came hither from other worlds, the interesting question as to the beginning of life remains. Helmholtz has said, "Organic life either has begun to exist at some one time or has existed for eternity." Evidently, the two notions are mutually exclusive. Which affords the most reasonable basis of explanation? The idea that life has existed in the universe from eternity and has simply been transferred from one world to another is known as the theory of cosmozoa. It was suggested by H. E. Richter, 1865, 70, and 71, who assumed that among particles moving about in space, like meteorites, there are the germs of microscopic organisms capable of establishing life on the Earth. Helmholtz and Sir William Thomson have discussed this question of the transference of living matter from other heavenly bodies to this Earth, and both term this view not unscientific. Helmholtz, 1884, held that meteors which swarm everywhere in space might be the bearers of such germs in their cool interior cavities. He thought it a correct scientific procedure to question whether life may not be even as old as matter, and its germs passed from world to world and developed wherever favorable conditions exist. In the present condition of knowledge, it is scarcely possible to obtain a direct contradiction of this doctrine and conclusive proof of its impossibility. This will be true so long as experience does not suffice to enable man to recognize as wholly impossible the transfer of protoplasmic germs of life from one world to another. But although direct contradiction of the doctrine is at present impossible, the thought that living substance has existed from eternity and has never originated from inorganic substance appears in the highest degree improbable. Setting aside the cosmozoa theory as improbable, and before considering the alternative view of the spontaneous generation of life from lifeless matter on the Earth, mention should be made of Prayer's view that living matter is the primary thing and that lifeless matter has been derived from the living. According to this view, life must have existed when the Earth was incandescent. Prayer fits his theory to this fact by giving to his conception of life a scope wider than that usually allowed, including not only present living matter, but also incandescent liquid masses as they once existed. Life then had no origin. It existed even in the beginning of the material universe. In fact, the view seems to identify life with motion. Evidently, the language used constitutes the chief difference between this and the doctrine that living matter as now recognized was spontaneously generated from matter customarily termed lifeless. Whether from primeval conditions, incandescent matter, which from our usual standpoint would certainly be considered lifeless, was really living and separated out that which we call lifeless, or whether it was lifeless with the power to evolve into living matter are questions of greater metaphysical flavor than of direct interest in the biological science of today. In either case, the original incandescent matter must have possessed the potentiality of evolving and differentiating into what is now recognized as living and lifeless matter. It matters little whether in philosophical moods it is sought to establish the primary vital force. For after all, as has been shown, vital force is not unique among the forces of the universe. One of the most suggestive works discussing the origin of life from lifeless matter on Earth is by the famous German physiologist Pflüger, 1875. He discussed the problem from the standpoint of physiological chemistry and follows it out far into detail. The essential point of Pflüger's investigation is constituted by the chemical characteristics of protein as that substance with which life in its essentials is inseparably united. There exists a fundamental difference between dead protein as it occurs, e.g. in egg albumin, and living protein as it constitutes living substance. This difference is the self-decomposition of the latter. All living substance is continually being decomposed, in some degree spontaneously, and more through outside influences, while dead protein under favorable conditions remains intact for an unlimited time. Further, Pfluger assumes on scientific grounds that the presence of cyanogen in living matter is responsible for the characteristic properties of living proteid, especially its great powers of decomposition. From this he concludes that the beginning of organic life was in cyanogen. Hence the problem of the origin of living substance culminates in the question, how does cyanogen arise? Here, organic chemistry presents the highly significant fact that cyanogen and its compounds, such as potassium cyanide, ammonium cyanide, hydrocyanic acid, cyanic acid, etc., arise only in an incandescent heat, e.g., when the necessary nitrogenous compounds are brought in contact with burning coal, or when the mass is heated to a white heat. Accordingly, nothing is clearer than the possibility of the formation of cyanogen compounds when the earth was wholly or partially in a fiery or heated state. Moreover, chemistry shows how the other essential constituents of proteid, such as the hydrocarbons, the alcohol radicals, etc., can likewise arise synthetically in heat. It is seen, says Pfluger, how strongly and remarkably all facts of chemistry point to fire as the force that has produced by synthesis the constituents of proteid. In other words, life is derived from fire, and its fundamental conditions were laid down at a time when the earth was still an incandescent ball. If now we consider the immeasurably long time during which the cooling of the earth's surface dragged itself slowly along, cyanogen and the compounds that contain cyanogen and hydrocarbon substances had time and opportunity to indulge extensively their great tendency toward transformation and polymerization, and to pass over with the aid of oxygen, and later of water and salts, into that self-destructive proteid, living matter. Pfluger thereupon summarizes his ideas in the following sentences. Accordingly, I would say that the first proteid to arise was living matter, endowed in all its radicals with the property of vigorously attracting similar constituents, adding them chemically to its molecule, and thus growing ad infinitum. According to this idea, living proteid does not need to have a constant molecular weight. It is a huge molecule undergoing constant, never-ending formation and constant decomposition, and probably behaves toward the usual chemical molecules as the sun behaves toward small meteors. In the plant, living proteid simply continues to do what it has always done since its origin, i.e., regenerate or grow. Wherefore I believe that all proteid existing in the world today was derived directly from the first proteid. This idea of Pfluger's in essentials is generally accepted, for most present-day biologists prefer to think of life as having originated directly from substances usually regarded as lifeless, and of all existing living proteid as having descended in direct continuity from the first proteid. Moreover, some biologists follow Helmholtz and others in thinking that the first proteid may possibly have originated in some other part of the universe, but astronomy and geology offer good reason for believing that living matter might have originated on the Earth when in its evolution to its present state, conditions became right for its development. However, notwithstanding all the speculations concerning the subject, it must be recognized that the problem is one of metaphysics rather than of natural science. The ordinary methods of scientific investigation are not applicable to the problem, and one can only theorize as to the basis of life as it is known. But there cannot be any certainty that life in its beginning, under possibly vastly different conditions from those obtaining today, possessed the distinctive properties discovered in it by modern science. That master of modern philosophical biology, Thomas H. Huxley, discussed the origin of life in his presidential address before the British Association for the Advancement of Science 40 years ago, and his words, while expressing the ideas outlined above, stand high among the statements of the philosophical problems of biology. Looking back through the prodigious vista of the past, he writes, I find no record of commencement of life, and therefore I am devoid of any means of forming a definite conclusion as to the condition of its appearance. Belief, in the scientific sense of the word, is a serious matter and needs strong foundations. To say, therefore, in the admitted absence of evidence, that I have any belief as to the mode in which the existing forms of life have originated, would be using words in a wrong sense. But expectation is permissible where belief is not, and if it were given to me to look beyond the abyss of geologically recorded time to the still more remote period when the earth was passing through physical and chemical conditions which it can no more see again than a man can recall his infancy, I should expect to be a witness of the evolution of living substance from non-living matter. I should expect to see it appear under forms of great simplicity, endowed, like existing fungi, with the power of determining the formation of new living matter from such matters as ammonium carbonates, oxalates and tartrates, alkaline and earthy phosphates, and water without the aid of light. That is the expectation to which analogical reasoning leads me. But I beg you once more to recollect that I have no right to call my opinion anything but an act of philosophical faith. The second question to be considered is that of spontaneous generation. The view that life originally began in non-living matter, i.e., was spontaneously generated, is commonly accepted by 20th century biology. But it should be noted that the belief in spontaneous generation of simple living matter in the early ages of the world's history is quite different from the belief that even today new living matter originates spontaneously without the influence of pre-existing living matter. This idea that living things, including even animals as complicated as flies and frogs, originate directly from lifeless matter, long after the first origin of life, has been widely accepted and is believed even today by many unscientific people. It is to this supposed origin of living matter within the period of human history that the term spontaneous generation, archegony, abiogenesis, generatio spontanea, or equivoca, is most commonly applied, and few authors of articles on the subject have included discussion of the first origin of life. Obviously, the fundamental problems would be the same, no matter whether the spontaneous appearance of life in lifeless matter occurred in the beginning of all life or occurs today. But the first is entirely beyond the power of scientific investigation, while if life now originates spontaneously, a critical application of the methods of modern science ought to prove it and to throw light on the method of origin. Investigators have therefore been stimulated to test the truth of the theory, and to look for the key which will unlock the mystery of the first origin of life. A vast amount of critical work has been done with the result that the biologists of the Victorian era proved that life does not originate spontaneously in any of the cases claimed to have been observed. In other words, life does not now spontaneously originate in lifeless matter so far as is known. This does not mean that it cannot or does not originate in some unknown form. This is a possibility which biologists recognize, and so they stand in an open-minded attitude, ready to witness the origin of life from lifeless matter, and really somewhat disappointed in that this opportunity has not yet come. The story of the theory of spontaneous generation is one of the most fantastic in all biology. Thomson says, if the longevity of a belief were an index to its truth, the theory of spontaneous generation should rank high among the veracities, for it flourished throughout 20 centuries and more. We cannot trace the history of the theory in all its details, but the story may be recommended to the psychological historian as a labyrinth of error, with glimpses of truth at every turn. The belief in spontaneous generation is recorded in literature back as far as Anaximander, 611 to 547 BC. He believed that eels and other aquatic forms are produced directly from lifeless matter. His pupil, Anaximenes, 588 to 524 BC, introduced the idea of primordial terrestrial slime, a mixture of earth and water, from which, under the influence of the sun's heat, plants, animals, and human beings are directly produced in the abiogenetic fashion, says Osborne in From the Greeks to Darwin. Diogenes and Xenophanes, the first to recognize the true nature of fossils, also believed in spontaneous generation. Then came the father of natural history, Aristotle, 384 to 322 BC, who fostered this idea so strongly that it has persisted more than 20 centuries. He taught that not only small animals, but even frogs, snakes, and eels are produced spontaneously from mud. Long after Aristotle, men found no difficulty in believing in cases of spontaneous generation which would now be rejected as monstrous by the most fanatical supporter of the doctrine. Shellfish of all kinds were considered to be without parental origin. Eels were supposed to spring spontaneously from the fat ooze of the Nile. Caterpillars were the spontaneous products of the leaves on which they fed, while winged insects, serpents, rats, and mice were all thought capable of being generated without sexual intervention. End of section 5. Section 6 of the Science History of the Universe, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Thomas Bosk. The Science History of the Universe, Volume 5, edited by Francis Rolt Wheeler. Biology, Chapter 4, The Origin of Life, Part 2. The development of embryology and the knowledge of the life histories of plants and animals gradually set aside many supposed cases of spontaneous generation. A little observation showed that individuals of these species developed from eggs produced by parents of the same species. But it is interesting to note that certain philosophers, notably among them being Augustine, 353 to 430, still held to spontaneous generation as occasionally happening in animals reproducing by the sexual method. According to Augustine, from the beginning there had existed two kinds of germs of living things. First, visible ones, placed by the Creator in animals and plants, and second, invisible ones, latent and becoming active only under certain conditions of combination and temperature. It is these which produce plants and animals in great numbers without any cooperation of existing organisms. This was a naturalistic way of explaining the sudden appearance of countless numbers of frogs, insects, and other animals, which today offers no difficulty, now that the remarkable fertility of animals is known. Even a man like Cesalpino, 1519 to 1603, who did some excellent botanical work, and had, long before Harvey, some clear ideas as to the circulation of the blood, believed that frogs might be generated from the mud with the help of sunshine, says Thompson, and even suggested a similar origin of the aboriginal Americans. The botanists were no better than zoologists. One of their favorite notions was that the green dust which grows in damp weather on trees and stones, which is now known to consist of unicellular algae, such as Pleurococcus, was a standing evidence of the genetic connection between the dead and the living, between the mineral and the vegetable. Even Bacon of Verulam believed in the spontaneous origin of some higher plants, like thistles, from earth, and the Italian botanist Mattioli regarded the duckweed, whose leaf-like shoots are so common on the surface of pools, as a condensation of the still water, and a starting point for higher forms of plant life, while even Harvey continued to believe in spontaneous generation. A scientific experiment to test spontaneous generation was first undertaken by Francesco Redi, a distinguished Italian physician and scholar. The origin of maggots from putrefying flesh had long been accepted as a clear case of spontaneous generation. Tyndall, in an article on spontaneous generation, writes of this as follows. Lacking the checks imposed by fuller investigation, the conclusion that flesh possesses and exerts this generative power is a natural one. I well remember, when a child of 10 or 12, seeing a joint of imperfectly salted beef cut into, and coils of maggots laid bare within the mass. Without a moment's hesitation, I jumped to the conclusion that these maggots had been spontaneously generated in the meat. I had no knowledge which could qualify or oppose this conclusion, and for the time it was irresistible. The childhood of the individual typifies that of the race, and the belief here enunciated was that of the world for nearly 2,000 years. To the examination of this very point, the celebrated Francesco Redi addressed himself in 1668. He had seen the maggots of putrefying flesh, and reflected on their possible origin. But he was not content with mere reflection, nor with the theoretic guesswork which his predecessors had founded upon their imperfect observations. Watching meat during its passage from freshness to decay, prior to the appearance of maggots, he invariably observed flies buzzing round the meat and frequently alighting on it. The maggots, he thought, might be the half-developed progeny of these flies. The inductive guess precedes experiment, by which, however, it must be finally tested. Redi knew this, and acted accordingly. Placing fresh meat in a jar and covering the mouth with paper, he found that, though the meat putrefied in the ordinary way, it never bred maggots, while the same meat placed in open jars soon swarmed with these organisms. For the paper cover he then substituted fine gauze, through which the odor of the meat could rise. Over it the flies buzzed, and on it they laid their eggs, but the meshes being too small to permit the eggs to fall through, no maggots were generated in the meat. They were, on the contrary, hatched upon the gauze. By a series of such experiments, Redi destroyed the belief in the spontaneous generation of maggots in meat, and with it, doubtless many related beliefs. The combat was continued by Vallisneri, Schwammerdam, and Reaumur, who succeeded in banishing the notion of spontaneous generation from the scientific minds of their day. Indeed, as regards such complex organisms as those which formed the subject of their researches, the notion was banished forever, so far as accepted science was concerned. However, to this day many untutored persons firmly believe that dead horsehairs placed in water transform themselves into horsehair eels, and that meat generates maggots and other forms of life. In the latter half of the 17th century, the great improvement of the microscope as an instrument of investigation paved the way to a new phase of the discussion of spontaneous generation. This came about because of the fact that the instrument brought into view a world of life formed of individuals so minute, so close as it seemed to the ultimate particles of matter, as to suggest an easy passage from atoms to organisms. Animal and vegetable infusions exposed to the air were found clouded and crowded with creatures far beyond the reach of unaided vision, but perfectly visible to an eye strengthened by the microscope. With reference to their origin, these organisms were called infusoria. Stagnant pools were found full of them, and the obvious difficulty of assigning a germinal origin to existences so minute furnished the precise condition necessary to give new play to the notion of heterogenesis or spontaneous generation. Many scientific men of that day took up the question of the origin of the microscopic organisms. A Scotch priest, Tuberville Needham, 1750, showed that animalcules, infusorians and the like, appeared even in decoctions which had been boiled and corked up. As we should now say, this result was due to imperfect sterilization and imperfect corking of the tubes. But it was used by Buffon, who was much interested in Needham's work, to bolster up a pet theory of his, that life resided in indestructible organic molecules, and that these were liberated after death, or in decomposition, as the aforesaid infusorians or animalcules. This result of Needham's was contradicted in 1777 by the Abbé Spallanzani, who charged his flasks with organic infusions, sealed their necks with the blowpipe, subjected them in this condition to the heat of boiling water, and subsequently exposed them to temperatures favorable to the development of life. The infusions continued unchanged for months, and when the flasks were subsequently opened, no trace of life was found. Spallanzani's flasks must have contained but little air, and it was objected by the chemists, who had now discovered oxygen, that life could not be expected where this gas was more or less absent, and that the boiling process might irretrievably injure the organic molecules. Schultz and Schwann, 1836-1837, were thus led to make fresh experiments. They carefully boiled the infusions and supplied air which had been passed through red-hot tubes or acids. No animalcules appeared. They then supplied air which had not been so purified, and in the same infusions the animalcules appeared. Schwann's final conclusion was that the putrefaction is due to decompositions of organic matter attendant on the multiplication therein of minute organisms. These organisms are derived not from the air, but from something contained in the air, which is destroyed by a sufficiently high temperature. The next step in advance came in 1854, when Schroeder and Dusch did what is now so often done as a class experiment. They boiled infusions, and while the steam was coming off, plugged the neck of the flask with cotton wool. This allows the passage of oxygen, but keeps back germs, and in most cases, the sterilization is quite effective. In 1859, a book was published which seemed to overturn some of the best established facts of previous investigators. Its title was Hereditary, and its author was F.A. Pouchet, director of the Museum of Natural History at Rouen, a strong believer in the theory of spontaneous generation. Never, says Tyndall, did a subject require the exercise of the cold, critical faculty more than this one. To a man of Pouchet's temperament, the subject was full of danger not lessened by the theoretic bias with which he approached it. Pasteur's work in chemistry and in special research in fermentation had prepared him for this investigation. He knew more than Pouchet as to the insidious ways of microbes. He showed the weak point of his antagonist's experiments, and gained the prize offered in 1860 by the Academy for well-contrived experiments to throw new light upon the question of spontaneous generation. Pasteur threw light on the subject by his study of the organized particles, many of them living or dead bacteria, which float in the air. He opened 20 sealed flasks containing organic infusions in the pure air of the Mer de Glace, and only one thereafter showed signs of life. But 8 out of 20 opened on the plains, and all of the 20 opened in town, developed germs. These and other experiments, carried out with a severity perfectly obvious to the instructed scientific reader, and accompanied by a logic equally severe, restored the conviction that, even in these lower reaches of the scale of being, life does not appear without the operation of antecedent life. Pasteur's brusque conclusion was that spontaneous generation is a chimera. These experiments by Pasteur laid the foundation for a long series of studies of microorganisms by himself, Tyndall, and others. Tyndall describes the famous experiment in which he proves that not in the air, nor in the infusions, nor in anything continuous diffused through the air, but in discrete, organic particles, suspended in the air and nourished by the infusions, we are to seek the cause of life, as follows. Supposing an infusion intrinsically barren, but readily susceptible of putrefaction when exposed to common air, to be brought into contact with unilluminable air, air freed from dust particles, what would be the result? It would never putrefy. Let a condensed beam be sent through a large flask or bolthead containing common air. The track of the beam is seen within the flask, the dust revealing the light, and the light revealing the dust. Cork the flask, stuff its neck with cotton wool, or simply turn its mouth downward and leave it undisturbed for a day or two. Examined afterward with the luminous beam, no track is visible. The light passes through the flask as through a vacuum. The floating matter has abolished itself, being now attached to the interior surface of the flask. Were it the object effectually to detain the dirt, that surface might be coated with some sticky substance. Here, then, without torturing the air in any way, is a means of ridding it, or rather of enabling it to rid itself of floating matter. We have now to devise a means, he continues, of testing the action of such spontaneously purified air upon putrescible infusions. Wooden chambers, or cases, accordingly are constructed, having glass fronts, side windows, and back doors. Through the bottoms of the chambers, test tubes pass airtight, their open ends, for about 1/5 of the length of the tubes, being within the chambers. Provision is made for a free connection through sinuous channels between the inner and the outer air. Through such channels, though open, no dust will reach the chamber. The top of each chamber is perforated by a circular hole 2 inches in diameter, closed airtight by a sheet of India rubber. This is pierced in the middle by a pin, and through the pinhole is pushed the shank of a long pipette, ending above in a small funnel. The shank also passes through a stuffing box of cotton wool moistened with glycerin, so that, tightly clasped by the rubber and wool, the pipette is not likely in its motions up and down to carry any dust into the chamber. The chamber is carefully closed and permitted to remain quiet for 2 or 3 days. Examined at the beginning by a beam sent through its windows, the air is found laden with floating matter, which in 3 days has wholly disappeared. To prevent its ever rising again, the internal surface of the chamber was at the outset coated with glycerin. The fresh but putrescible liquid is introduced into the 6 tubes in succession by means of the pipette. Permitted to remain without further precaution, every one of the tubes would putrefy and fill itself with life. The liquid has been in contact with the dust-laden air outside by which it has been infected, and the infection must be destroyed. This is done by plunging the 6 tubes into a bath of heated oil and boiling the infusion. The time requisite to destroy the infection depends wholly upon its nature. 2 minutes boiling suffices to destroy some contagia, whereas 200 minutes boiling fails to destroy others. After the infusion has been sterilized, the oil bath is withdrawn, and the liquid, whose putrescibility has been in no way affected by the boiling, is abandoned to the air of the chamber. With such chambers I tested, in the autumn and winter of 1875-6, infusions of the most various kinds, embracing natural animal liquids, the flesh and viscera of domestic animals, game, fish, and vegetables. More than 50 chambers, each with its series of infusions, were tested, many of them repeatedly. There was no shade of uncertainty in any of the results. In every instance we had within the chamber perfect limpidity and sweetness, which in some cases lasted for more than a year. Without the chamber, with the same infusion, putridity and its characteristic smells. In no instance was the least countenance lent to the notion that an infusion deprived by heat of its inherent life, and placed in contact with air cleansed of its visibly suspended matter, has any power to generate life anew. The argument is now to be clenched by an experiment which will remove every residue of doubt as to the ability of the infusions here employed to sustain life. We open the back doors of our sealed chambers, and permit the common air with its floating particles to have access to our tubes. For 3 months they have remained pellucid and sweet, flesh, fish, and vegetable extracts purer than ever cook manufactured. 3 days' exposure to the dusty air suffices to render them muddy, fetid, and swarming with infusorial life. The liquids are thus proved, one and all, ready for putrefaction when the contaminating agent is applied. Many such experiments as these established beyond a doubt the fact that no known case of spontaneous generation occurs under the present conditions of life. Omne vivum e vivo would correctly express the accepted view of the 20th century biologists, provided it be translated, all life from life, under known existing conditions. But probably life from the lifeless in its first origin on this earth or elsewhere. That all living matter existing today has descended directly from pre-existing living matter is the doctrine of biogenesis, the rival of the dethroned doctrine of abiogenesis. Observe that the doctrine of biogenesis refers simply to what is now happening and has been happening in all times of which we have strictly scientific records. The theory of biogenesis, thus understood as the prevailing natural process, will still stand even if, as seems probable, some lucky physiological chemist succeeds in synthesizing under artificial conditions new living matter, entirely independent of pre-existing living matter. He will have done nothing more than repeat under unusual and artificially controlled conditions the processes which probably occurred when in the evolution of matter in the post-incandescent ages of the earth-living proteid, progenitor of all future organisms, first came into existence. So far as the future succession of organisms on this earth is concerned, it cannot even be imagined that living matter synthesized in scientific laboratories will play any part. The law of biogenesis, now established as firmly as that of gravitation, may be expected to stand as the very rock of ages in the science of biology. Such is the outline, the story of one of the greatest fallacies with which modern science has had to deal. But strange to say, the establishment of the truth of biogenesis, which directly is of little importance to man, has laid the foundation for practical researches of a most momentous kind. To Pasteur and the other great generals in the last battles against the theory of spontaneous generation is due the honor of the establishment of the new science of bacteriology, which in the last 2 decades has come to play such a mighty part in the development of modern life. End of section 6.
Section 7 of the Science, History of the Universe, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. The Science, History of the Universe, Volume 5, edited by Francis Rolt Wheeler. Biology, Chapter 5, Cell Life, Part 1. In the 2 preceding chapters, living substance has been spoken of as existing in separate organic individuals, plants and animals. It is not known to exist in a mass not organized as an individual plant or animal. Many early philosophers did conceive of living matter as existing without individualization. Thus Oken, 1805, in his Schleim theory, when he says that every organic thing came from primitive slime, which originated in the sea from organic matter in the course of planetary evolution, simply repeated an idea passed down by the Greek philosopher Anaximenes and others. Haeckel's theory of the Monera as the simplest living things allies him to this belief. He says, in the Monera, the simplest conceivable organisms, the whole body consists merely of plasm, corresponding to the primitive slime of the earlier natural philosophers. And again, in the Natural History of Creation, he describes the Monera as simple, soft, albuminous lumps without component parts, whose whole albuminous body is as homogeneous in itself as an inorganic crystal. Huxley also for a time supported this view. In 1869, he described a peculiar sticky mud from the bottom of the Atlantic. The stickiness was apparently due to the presence of innumerable lumps of a transparent, gelatinous substance without discoverable nuclei or membranous envelopes. Huxley interpreted this matter to be masses of protoplasm. He thought it a new form of the simple animate things, Monera, which had been described by Haeckel, and therefore named it Bathybius Haeckelii. Haeckel himself examined the mud and agreed with Huxley's interpretation. Later studies, however, convinced Huxley that the slime was in reality some sort of inorganic precipitate, and at the British Association meeting in 1879, he made a public renunciation of Bathybius. Leaving this interesting historical conception of living matter in extensive, undifferentiated masses, the idea of the individualization of living substance prevails in modern biological science. An organic individual is a unitary mass of living substance. Microscopic study of plants and animals shows them to be made up of these unitary masses, the cells. An illustration will make this point clear. Dissection shows that an organ of an animal's body is composed of several building materials or tissues, such as muscular tissue, nervous tissue, bony tissue, etc. The microscopic study of these tissues reveals the fact that they are composed of small masses of protoplasm, the cells. Hence, a plant or animal with several tissues is a multicellular organism. There are many simple plants and animals whose body consists of a single cell, and these are called unicellular animals. Every such simple organism is an individual. The cell then is the lowest stage of individuality. It is true, as will be explained in detail later, that the microscope reveals different structures in cells. Especially characteristic are the main body of the cell, the cytoplasm, and the nucleus embedded in it. This suggests the possibility that the cell is composed of still lower individuals. However, many studies have shown that neither nucleus nor cytoplasm can exist independently, and hence they cannot be regarded as unit masses or individuals. The cell is the lowest stage of individuality known to modern biology. Looking at the organic world synthetically, the cell stands prominent in a scheme of the 5 stages of individuality found there. Individuals of the first order are cells. They represent elementary organisms that are not composed of lower units capable of life. An example is any unicellular animal or plant. Individuals of the second order are tissues. The tissues are associations of individuals of the first order, each one of which is like the others. Examples are muscular and nervous tissues of an animal, the conducting and supporting tissues of a plant. Individuals of the third order are organs. The organs are associations of various kinds of individuals of the second order. Examples are the stomach and heart of an animal, the leaf and root of a plant. Individuals of the fourth order are complex organisms. These are associations of various individuals of the third order. Examples are common animals and plants, whose bodies consist of organs united. Individuals of the fifth order are communities. The communities are associations of the individuals of the fourth order. It should be noted that an individual of a higher order consists of an assemblage of those of the next lower order. Thus, communities consist of persons, persons of organs, organs of tissues, and tissues of cells. In the end, all living individual plants and animals are composed of cells, and the cell is the seat of those events, the expression of which is life. The cell is the life unit, the elementary organism, or as Virchow has said, the vital elementary unit. The realization that it is in the cell that the answers to the great problems of biology are to be found is quite modern. Nevertheless, this fact has already profoundly modified many phases of the science of life. Professor Wilson of Columbia University, justly regarded as one of the foremost biologists who have worked at the problem of cytology, or the biology of cells, has well outlined the influence of the cell theory on modern biology. He says, "It was the cell theory that first brought the structure of plants and animals under one point of view by revealing their common plan of organization. It was through the cell theory that Kolliker, Remak, Nageli, and Hofmeister opened the way to an understanding of the nature of embryonic development and the law of genetic continuity lying at the basis of inheritance. It was the cell theory again which, in the hands of good Sir Virchow and Max Schulze, inaugurated a new era in the history of physiology and pathology by showing that all the various functions of the body, in health and in disease, are but the outward expression of cell activities. And at a still later day, it was through the cell theory that Hertzwig, Fohl, Van Beneden, and Strasburger solved the long-standing riddle of the fertilization of the egg and the mechanism of hereditary transmission. No other biological generalization, save only the theory of organic evolution, has brought so many apparently diverse phenomena under a common point of view, or has accomplished more for the unification of knowledge. The cell theory must, therefore, be placed beside the evolution theory as one of the foundational stones of modern biology." The history of the development of the idea that cells are the elementary units of living matter is essential to an understanding of present-day problems, and therefore a rapid survey of the important historical points may be made. These have been well traced by Oskar Hertzwig, professor at Berlin, in his famous Die Seele und die Gewebe. The conception or idea connected with the word cell, used scientifically, he says, has been considerably altered during the last 50 years. The history of the various changes in this conception, or the history of the cell theory, is of great interest, and nothing could be more suitable than to give a short account of this history in order to introduce the beginner to the series of conceptions connected with the word cells. This indeed may prove useful in other directions. For while on the one hand we see how the conception of the cell, which is at present accepted, has developed gradually out of the older and less complete conceptions, we realize, on the other hand, that we cannot regard it as final or perfect, but on the contrary, we have every ground to hope that better and more delicate methods of investigation, due partly to improved optical instruments, may greatly add to our present knowledge, and may perhaps enrich it with a quite new series of conceptions. The theory that organisms are composed of cells was first suggested by the study of plant structure. At the end of the 17th century, the Italian Marcellus Malpighi and the Englishman Gru gained the first insight into the more delicate structure of plants. By means of low magnifying powers, they discovered in the first place small room-like spaces provided with firm walls and filled with fluid, the cells, and in the second, various kinds of long tubes, which in most parts are embedded in the ground tissue, and which from their appearance are now called spiral ducts or vessels. Much greater importance, however, was attached to these facts after the investigations which were carried on in a more philosophical spirit by Bonn toward the end of the 18th century were published. Caspar Friedrich Wolff, Oken, and others raised the question of the development of plants and endeavored to show the ducts and vessels originated in cells. Above all, Trevor Rannes rendered important service by proving in his treatise entitled Vom Individuellen Bau der Wagaske, published in 1808, that vessels develop from cells. The study of the lowest plants has also proved of the greatest importance in establishing the cell theory. Small algae were observed, which during their whole lifetime remain either single cells or consist of simple rows of cells, easily to be separated from one another. Finally, the study of the metabolism of plants led investigators to believe that, in the economy of the plant, it is the cell which absorbs the nutrient substances, elaborates them, and gives them up in an altered form. Thus, at the beginning of the last century, the cell was recognized by many investigators as the morphological and physiological elementary unit of the plant. These views, however, only obtained general acceptance after the year 1838, when M. Schleiden, who is so frequently cited as the founder of the cell theory, published in Müller's archives his famous paper, Beitrage zur Phytogenesis. In this paper, Schleiden endeavored to explain the mystery of cell formation. He thought he had found the key to the difficulty in the discovery of the English botanist R. Brown, who, in the year 1833, while making investigations upon orchids, discovered nuclei. Schleiden made further discoveries in this direction. He showed that nuclei are present in many plants, and as they are invariably found in young cells, the idea occurred to him that the nucleus must have a near connection with the mysterious beginning of the cell, and in consequence must be of great importance in its life history. The way in which Schleiden made use of this idea, which was based upon erroneous observations, to build up a theory of phytogenesis, must now be regarded as a mistake. On the other hand, it must not be forgotten that his perception of the general importance of the nucleus was correct up to a certain point, and that this one idea has in itself exerted an influence far beyond the narrow limits of the science of botany, for it was owing to this that the cell theory was first applied to animal tissues. for it is just in animal tissues that the nuclei stand out most distinctly from among all the other cell contents, thus showing most evidently the similarity between the histological elements of plants and animals. Thus this little treatise of Schleiden's in 1838 marks an important historical turning point, and since this time the most important work in the building up of the cell theory has been done upon animal tissues. Attempts to represent the animal body as consisting of a large number of extremely minute elements had been made before Schleiden's time, as is shown by the hypotheses of Oken, Husinger, Rapspale, and many other writers. However, it was impossible to develop these theories further, since they were based upon so many incorrect observations and false deductions that the good in them was outweighed by their errors. Schwann, however, was the first to attempt to frame a really comprehensive cell theory, which should refer to all kinds of animal tissues. During the year 1838, Schwann, in the course of a conversation with Schleiden, was informed of the new theory of cell formation and of the importance which was attached to the nucleus in plant cells. It immediately struck him, as he himself relates, that there are a great many points of resemblance between animal and vegetable cells. He therefore, with most praiseworthy energy, set on foot a comprehensive series of experiments, the results of which he published in 1839. Thus Schwann originated a theory which, although imperfect in many respects, yet is applicable both to plants and animals, and which, further, is easily understood and in main correct. According to this theory, every part of the animal body is either built up of elements corresponding to the plant cells massed together, or is derived from such elements which have undergone certain metamorphoses. This theory has formed a satisfactory foundation, upon which many further investigations have been based. However, it has been mentioned already, the conception which Schleiden and Schwann formed of the plant and animal element was incorrect in many respects. They both defined the cell as a small vesicle, with a firm membrane enclosing fluid contents, that is to say, as a small chamber or cellula, in the true sense of the word. They considered the membrane to be the most important and essential part of the vesicle, for they thought in consequence of its chemical-physical properties, it related to the metabolism of the cell. The series of conceptions which now associate with the word cell are, thanks to the great progress made during the last 50 years, essentially different from the above. Schleiden and Schwann's cell theory has undergone a radical reform, having been superseded by the protoplasmic theory, which is especially associated with the name of Max Schulze. The history of the protoplasmic theory is also of supreme interest. Even Schleiden observed in the plant cell, in addition to the cell sap, a delicate transparent substance containing small granules. This substance he called plant slime. In the year 1846, Moll called it protoplasm, a name which has since become so significant, and which before had been used by Perkina for the substance of which the youngest animal embryos are formed. Further, he presented a new picture of the living appearance of plant protoplasm. He discovered that it completely filled up the interior of young plant cells, and that in larger and older cells it absorbed fluid, which collected into droplets or vacuoles. Finally, Moll established the fact that protoplasm, as has been already stated by Schleiden about the plant slime, shows strikingly peculiar movements. These were first discovered in the year 1772 by Bonaventure Corti, and later in 1807 by C. L. Treviranus, and were described as the circulatory movements of the plant sap. By degrees, further discoveries were made, which added to the importance attached to these protoplasmic contents of the cell. In the lowest algae, as observed by Kahn and others, the protoplasm draws itself away from the cell membrane at the time of reproduction and forms a naked oval body, the swarm spore, which lies freely in the cell cavity. This swarm spore soon breaks down the membrane at one spot, after which it creeps out through the opening and swims about in the water by means